Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Laura Marsh. Laura, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Laura Marsh. I'm the literary editor of The New Republic.
Thanks so much for coming on. So our topic today is going to be the very controversial biography of Philip Roth and certain events and accusations that have been made clear in the past week or so about the author of that biography, Blake Bailey. And so I did a previous episode with Jacques Berliner-Blau on Roth. He has a book coming out on Roth in the fall that's highly critical of Roth's writing on race and gender and other things. And so we batted that back and forth, and neither of us had seen the biography at that point, but some of the early reviews were trickling in. And I think maybe a week after we recorded, you reviewed the book in the New Republic, and you gave it a pretty negative review. And this is, I think I've read more reviews of this book than any book in years, maybe. Like, this is clearly seen as a huge literary event, even before the accusations against Bailey were surfaced. And so, everyone, they bring out the heavy hitters in a lot of these reviews, and it's like 900 pages. And at this point, I feel like even a month ago, I was like, there's no way I could read this now because my brain has been totally fried by the events of the past couple of years. And a 900-page biography, even of my favorite American novelist, probably I'm not going to be able to get through it. It'll just put me to sleep. But so you gave a negative review. There were some early reviews that were, somewhat equivocal and used inventive writing techniques to try to get at Roth, including one where Roth's ghost reviews the book from the afterlife and other such things. And then, so I got a couple of 5-star reviews from Remnick in the New Yorker and New York Times Book Review. Was it Cynthia Ozick reviewed it in the Times Book Review? But they're one of the normal reviewers, Parul Sehgal, if that's how you pronounce your name, gave it more of a pan. And so it seemed like, mixed. Some people really loved it, some people not so much. And then, but it was just getting a huge, this is the first big book of, the year post-pandemic. People are just maybe excited to think about something that didn't have anything to do with Trump or the pandemic or something. And then a week or so ago, there's reporting in the Times-Picayune, or was they broke the story, and then other places started reporting out about accusations of sexual assault against the biographer Blake Bailey, and quote unquote grooming women who were his students when he taught at a middle school before he was a writer, who he had sexual encounters with later in life when they were adults. And so some of these, I think people were, very shocked. And this was like, a New York Times news alert talking about this thing. And he has since sort of withdrawn from the public space and is issuing, comments via lawyers now. And there's lots of bizarre aspects to this related to how various institutions, like his publisher, responded to women who reached out to them. So it's a huge mess. And so I'm interested in talking to you about it because you zeroed in on some of the stuff, before the recent accusations came forward that seemed like you were seeing something that maybe some other people like David Remnick were not seeing in this book. Okay, so did I get all that right? Is there anything that should be corrected in that spiel I just gave?
I think that was a pretty good summary. I mean, it's hard to summarize everything that happened here because there's so many twists and turns. And like you said, it's a huge mess. Like, I think there are still things we'll find out as time goes by and there's more reporting. But I think that those are the basic contours of what's happened so far. Okay.
So it was just announced. So the publisher is Norton, which is it the last major publisher that's independent at this point, or are they actually owned by some international conglomerate?
So I believe that they are an employee-owned company, independent company. I'm not an expert. I didn't research that beforehand, but they're a venerable publisher, right? Like, everyone knows Norton. from the anthologies they published, Norton Critical Editions, and they're a great publisher of new nonfiction and fiction in a moment where actually that's a really, really difficult business.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's been this huge consolidation in publishing, over the past 20, 30 years, and there used to be like the big six, and now it's like the big four, because Penguin and Random House combined anyway. So Norton, a serious literary press that puts out serious work, decided that they would stop publication on the book, and so I guess you're not going to be able to get new copies of it if you if people want to find out what all the controversy is about. So that's, of course, this gets into like the cancel culture narrative that seems to be taking over our lives over the past couple of years, and I have conflicting thoughts about this. But okay, so I guess, well, let me say what I thought. So when I read your review, after reading this one by Kristen Lawrenson, if I'm saying his last name correctly, that a lot of the reviews of this are like, well, we have to basically sort of narrate the arc of Roth's life because that's what people expect in a review of a huge 900-page biography, and so they recapitulate a lot of the things that happened, and it's sort of like the line between reviewing this book, Philip Roth, a biography, if that's what it's called, versus like reviewing Philip Roth, now historical figure, and man who committed various offenses over the course of his life, and also wrote 30-odd books. And some people consider him one of the great American authors of all time. And yeah, so when I read yours, I was thinking, when I initially read your review, I was thinking kind of like, okay, like Philip Roth, like he's kind of an asshole. Like it kind of seems that like that's clear, and it's weird because he wrote so autobiographically in most of his work, but also like rejected this idea that he was an autobiographical writer, which just doesn't make any sense to me. But like clearly, he was, most of his characters had shared biographical details with himself, and he acted towards various people, mostly women who he had relationships with, in bad ways. And so a lot of the details of the specific ways he treated women badly are like brought forth in this biography. But then I guess Bailey inserts like commentary saying like, or basically framing everything to excuse Roth's behavior and paint the women who he was in conflict with in a negative light. Is that like jibe with what's actually in the book, which I have not read, and at this point probably will not read because, as I said, it's 900 pages, and now you can't even buy it anymore. So, yeah.
I know the barriers to you getting a hold of a copy of this book, unless you want to listen to the audiobook, which I believe has been licensed to a third party that's taken no action. Like that would be your main way of accessing this book right now. I think it's really complicated. That'd be like 20 or 30
hours.
But yeah, that would be a rough listen.
Yeah.
And just very, very strange way to consume this genre of writing anyway. No, I think it's really complicated, right? Because when you have a book like this, there's sort of two ways you can go as a reviewer. One is to write your big piece on Philip Roth, and you're just using the book and the information in the book to kind of pick out the good bits, the interesting stuff, and construct your kind of like vision of like, this is how I see Philip Roth. And those are really, really fun pieces to read. They often have lasting value. Often that's the kind of piece I would encourage a reviewer to try and do, because I think that people are a lot more interested in Philip Roth, right, than in whoever ends up being his biographer, as a general rule. Like we just recently ran a piece of biography of Graham Greene. And like, I want that to be an essay about Graham Greene, not about the guy named Richard Greene who wrote the book, because I'm interested in Graham Greene. I think our readers are mostly interested in Graham Greene. Same goes for Philip Roth. So normally I would not be like, I wouldn't want the author of a biography to have such a big part in the coverage of it, because it's just not that interesting. I mean, to some extent, you do want to comment on how is this person presenting the author, because you could say they emphasize such and such, but actually I would emphasize something else, like so you feel something to push back against when you're presenting your vision of Philip Roth. This case just struck me as kind of an exception to the way I would normally approach a piece like that, because of the way the book was written, made it so hard to get through, and also just really felt very disruptive to the narrative, because the telling of the story feels so biased against so many of the people in the story that you start questioning, like, what really happened. And I think once you're in that relationship with the book, you have to say something about it, because it's such a big part of your experience of understanding the life.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the New Yorker often runs, when there's like a big new biography of some figure, the New Yorker often runs a piece where it's more like a historical recounting of the life of the figure. And if you don't know a lot about that figure, you can learn a quick, sort of summary of their life, and maybe get more interested in learning about them or reading the book that's being reviewed itself. But, sometimes it's like more than half of what they're talking about is just, what Proust's childhood or something, if it's a biography of Proust. And,
and sometimes they won't even mention the book, like the title of it, until like the second page. It's very much in passing. And I think those kinds of pieces are really like fun to read. They're a great entry point for people who like haven't been thinking about this a lot, or are just looking for like a new view, like a new kind of way of understanding the series of facts that they might be familiar with. So that's a completely valid way to do criticism, I think, in most situations. Like, that's what I went into this expecting to do. Like, I was going to write a piece about, grappling with Philip Roth as like an author I had really avoided reading for a long time, and then had started to read and was very surprised. Like, this was not the author I thought he was when I started actually reading his books. And I felt like there's something interesting there. But that whole project got derailed when I read the biography itself.
Okay, that's interesting. I would like to read that essay, the original conception of that essay also, and maybe we could just talk about that a little bit later. But okay, so stuff I didn't mention yet is that this is the authorized biography, and Roth had a lot of drama involving other potential biographers, and that like is incorporated into the biography. So there's this sort of meta aspect, which is very Rothian, where he's like, he grows to hate this guy who he enlisted to write the biography initially, and even like writes a manuscript essentially that rebuts the things that he is doing already, which is kind of crazy. And so clearly, Roth was very concerned about how he would be remembered, and he handpicked this guy Bailey after rejecting various other people, and even threatening lawsuits against various other people who might have engaged in this project. Roth, Bailey pitched himself to Roth. Roth agreed to go with Bailey. Bailey had previously written biographies of John Cheever and Richard Yates, who wrote, what is it? Not Independence Road. What is that book called?
Revolutionary Road.
Revolutionary Road. So somewhat more compared to Roth, less prominent figures. But I guess those books were favorably received. I haven't read either of them, but. So then once these, one thing I wondered when I was reading, after I read your review before the recent allegations came out, and then reading more positive ones like the glowing review that Remnick gave it, was like, okay, so Bailey unearths these things that Roth said or did in his past, and then he kind of like justifies them in some way. That's what it seems like. But you don't have to buy his justification if he unearths this fact. So just a lot of crazy shit that Roth did. Like, he tried to trick his first wife into moving, he was going to move to New York, and actually he's going to move to Palo Alto, where he's going to get that to me was one of the funnier parts of the book, where he's like, oh, maybe if I tell her that I'm going to move to New York, and then I introduce her to some editors there, one of whom was Bob Silvers, whom I used to work for. So I found him very, very funny. The New York Review of Books founder?
Yeah, the editor of the New York Review of Books, who I think was maybe an editor at Harper's at the time that all this is going on. But his idea was if he could trick his wife to moving there, or then girlfriend, they would give her a job so she would stay in New York, and then he would secretly go to Stanford.
Which is
It's
crazy.
like
So just describing the facts of that, like you're like tricking someone about where you're moving in the country. I guess this would be impossible today, but even in like 1962 or whatever, this is not like a plan that. So he ended up not getting the fellowship at Stanford, so he couldn't put this plan into effect. But that's just crazy that he thought that. And so does like Bailey present like a sympathetic portrayal of that, or does he lay out the facts and he's like, but really Roth like was making a good decision at the time, blah blah blah.
Right. So this is a story that's from the kind of larger arc of Roth's relationship with his first wife, this woman, Margaret Martinson, which is a very, very mysterious relationship because they are dating for a really long, like several years. And in Bailey's telling, like she's just this villain from the beginning. Like from the very beginning, you're just told this is going to be a really bad relationship. So as you're going through like all the periods of them dating, you're just like, if he hates her so much, why don't they break up? Like there's so many opportunities to break off this relationship. Okay. And there are like little glimmers of Roth telling people like, actually, it's kind of my fault that she's upset so much. And like, I don't treat her well enough, and like showing that he kind of wants to be in a relationship. But because the whole thing's presented as like, she's this really bad person who then like tricks Roth into marrying her, you never really understand what the relationship actually was, because of course it can't have just been that she tricked him into marrying him, because she didn't trick him into dating her for so long. And he does seem to have engaged with her on this level, like voluntarily, for over a fairly long period of time, that suggests that they actually did share something, even if it was very fraught and full of fights and horrible behavior from both of them. So this like little story about him deciding like maybe he'll tell her he's moving to New York and actually go to Palo Alto is part of that period where you're like, what is this relationship between these two people? And when I was reading the biography, I kept thinking, I just wish that like, he'd been able to talk to some people who knew Maggie, who could have shed some light on this, or some of the Roth friends, like why do you think they were together? Because just talking to Roth, just from the interviews with Roth, all you get is like, I hate this person, it's so traumatic, because he's talking from a distance of years after a divorce. And so you never really understand. It all seems very illogical and weird because there's no extra perspective on what happened. And of course, she isn't alive to try and explain what she thinks happened.
Okay, right. So there's, maybe, so you could say a more skilled biographer would have been able to, present, like, look at these two humans and why they decided to do these things and make it make sense. Yeah. Why did they stick together? What was the, what was the attraction? And then, so she, and correct me if I have some of the details wrong. This was, I mainly know this from both the reviews and the fictionalized versions he presents in various books, is that she like faked a pregnancy by buying urine from a woman who was pregnant, and then told him that she had aborted the baby, and that was like ensnared him into, because he felt so bad for her, into the marriage. And then they had this very tumultuous relationship, and then she was killed by being hit by a car while she was a pedestrian in, I think, Central Park, and that because she had like refused to agree to a divorce or something, and so this like was this crazy thing that like freed Roth from the like responsibility of being connected to this person who he came to totally despise. And so that's like the Rothian perspective on how the relationship went, is that he was like rescued by fate.
And like that story. So actually, I think she was in a car on the Central Park Transverse, and the driver was drunk. They were on the way home from a party, and they crashed. That's how she died. That was like in the middle of her divorce from Roth, which was really drawn out and complicated, but was going to mean that he was going to have to pay her alimony of some kind, which to me doesn't seem strange at all. Like that's what happens when you get divorced. Like the assets are divided. There's a provision for the partner who came into it with less or leaves with less. But the Roth version of this story kind of pops up in other of his works, and then in his autobiography. And he has this like very provocative presentation of her dying, where he says, that he looks at the corpse and says, "You're dead and I didn't have to do it." And I think people have written about that a lot, to say that Roth was completely like, you're relieved, freed from this marriage, very happy about the death of his soon to be ex-wife. I'm sure that's true on some level, but I think you have to contextualize the way he wrote about it. It was in like a work of creative nonfiction. Like, I don't think it was a completely straight-faced proclamation. Like, it was meant to be provocative and uncomfortable. And
right, so this is in the Facts.
In the Facts, which is like this very like stylish work. I still think it's obviously like a really repellent thing to say, but he was aware of that and he was kind of like pushing it. And what's weird to me is then to see critics and the biographer just treat it really literally and then endorse it. Because it's one thing for someone to be like, oh, I had this horrible feeling, like this horrible feeling I know I shouldn't have about something they experienced. It's another thing for other people to say, it's great that your wife died. Like, that's the thing that's always struck me as so messed up around Roth, is that he brings more sophistication and ambiguity to these things in his books than his critics are capable of actually incorporating when they write about him. I've read some reviews that actively celebrate this woman's death on his behalf. And I find that shocking in a culture in which, like, just for some context, men do kill their wives. Like, intimate partner violence is a really horrific problem that's rather unpunished in this country and elsewhere. And I think that there's like a very misogynist narrative there to like, for critics to be celebrating the death of a woman just because she was going to get alimony. Like, that just strikes me as so messed up. So all of that, I felt like once you lose the nuance, you slip very quickly into some quite horrifying misogynist ideas about who deserves what and who kind of deserves to exist.
Okay, yeah. And so what the thing with the Facts is that, you know, he wrote this memoir autobiography that, because he had fictionalized so much of his life, he was like, okay, this is what really happened, and, you know, removing like the commentary and the fictionalization from it. But he includes these bookends using his fictional alter ego Nathan Zuckerman, saying like an introduction and a conclusion from this fictional character saying like, you shouldn't publish this. So, you know,
and he changes names. He doesn't use Maggie's real name. So, I mean, how factual is it? He's not even using her real name in the book.
Okay, yeah.
He's still taking license with all of it.
So he wrote a book called The Facts that supposedly is autobiography, but...
It's an ironic title.
Yeah, so he's always messing around with this stuff. And so you would hope that the eventual biographer who had to sort through all this stuff would be, you know, punctilious, is that the word and how you pronounce it? You know, would really do his or her best to nail everything down and have a very objective sense. What was true, what was false, what was, you know, printing the legend versus printing the fact kind of thing. And so before the allegations came out against Bailey, it seemed like he, you know, a mixed bag of whether he accomplished that or not. And then one of the things that, so there also was all these, like, there was a profile in the New York Times Magazine of Bailey, you know, like 10 days or so before the allegations came out by Mark Oppenheimer, that was very laudatory. And, you know, there's just been so much press about this. So it mentions that there's a lot of stuff that, okay, Roth, you know, was kept everything, you know, he wrote like in boxes or files, whatever. And Bailey had access to things that are currently like in the Roth archive, but might be destroyed by the archive at some point. So maybe he's the only one who has ever read like this manuscript that Roth wrote that was rebutting the memoir that his second wife, Claire Bloom, wrote called Leaving a Doll's House, that he intended to publish. And then like his friends and lawyers convinced him not to publish. So, you know, maybe like 5 people have actually read this thing and Bailey is one of them and it might be destroyed. And then, so that's kind of crazy. But then if you're thinking like, oh, maybe this Bailey fellow happens to be, you know, a sociopathic rapist, then suddenly that like throws everything in terms of like the historical record into the air. And, so then I'm like throwing up my hands, being like, I don't know what what to think of any of this anymore. So what did you? So why don't we move somewhat into the? I guess one more thing. So, you know, so now we know. I don't know if this crazy story about Roth trying to trick her into moving to New York when he was actually absconding to Palo Alto, if that had been like previously reported anywhere. So we have that. We have like the facts. Like Bailey has written these things down in the book that is harder to access than it was a week ago. But like, so now we all know that story, and maybe Bailey tried to spin it as like, well, he just wanted the best for her and like to get a job as a secretary for Bob Silvers or something. But like, we still have, that's his spin on it. And we have the fact, and we have, you point out, you excerpt some quotes, the way that Bailey describes Martinson, the first wife, talking about Roth being disgusted by the shape of her and color of her vagina. So I assume Roth is the one who said that. And
well, so yes, but so that's a really, really weird thing that comes into the book. Number one, I think that was actually when I started reading the book with my antenna up a little more, because before that I was just, reading about his childhood in Newark, and it's a little bit boring, but there's nothing questionable about it. When the vagina thing comes in, you're just like, whoa, we're 4 pages into having met this woman. I think it's about 4 pages into like her being introduced. And the reason I paused on it is because there's no such thing as a discolored vagina. Like, that doesn't exist. It's something you can't know because, as someone on Twitter pointed out, it's internal, unless they meant the vulva, which is a different part of the female body. But also, it kind of comes off as something that Roth volunteered about his wife.
Who else could have provided this quote?
Right, but that's actually not the way it happens. So, like, if you look at the book closely, which I know obviously you can't,
and probably won't at this point.
That description of a withered and discolored vagina comes from a novel that he wrote, and it describes the character. And then what happens is Bailey asks him if this was based on Maggie's vagina, and Roth says yes. So it's not like Roth actually Roth has written this about a fictional character, which is questionable itself, and we could deal with that separately, but it isn't a fictional thing. And then Bailey seems to have asked him, like solicited this, like needed to know if this was true of Maggie. And Roth says yes. And then like elaborates a little bit about like how horrifying it all was. So I don't know, that's not to exonerate Roth, but it is sort of a curious detail in that the biographer actively solicits this information, because I don't think it's something that any of us needed to know. And also it doesn't make sense narratively, because if her vagina was so disgusting, why were they dating for so long? They were in a sexual relationship for all this time. It's just clearly like doesn't make any sense.
It's deeply strange, but so we know. The book. This is in like My Life as a Man or something. Like it's in one of the fictional portrayals that Roth includes this line in one of his novels about a woman having a disgusting, discolored vagina. So we knew that for like 30 or 40 years already that he had written this, and maybe no one really paid close attention to it before Bailey asked him point blank, like, was this referring to this actual living person who had died in this tragic way? And so we already knew that Roth was thinking about, vaginas and whether they are colored or discolored or whatever. And we know that Roth was like thinking about vaginas a lot over the course of his career because, one of the sections of Puerto Rico's complaint is called Chasing Cunt. This is all out there that he and his fictional characters are well, the conflation is so tricky, but many of his characters are these like sex obsessed men, and so the fact that that we now know that Roth thought that his deceased ex-wife had a vagina that disgusted him. So I guess like in terms of like the history of Roth historiography or whatever, like it's good to know that additional fact that like he was thinking about that, and we could maybe Blake Bailey excuses it, but you and I talking about it like, wow, this is bizarre that he was thinking about it. So I think it's good that we have this additional fact about this important literary historical figure. But most people would say this makes him look worse, not like excusing why he threw her aside because he was disgusted by a vagina. Does this make sense, or am I?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it makes him look worse. And obviously, like, that was the theme of the piece I wrote, that he sort of opened up about all of his grievances and it ended up looking really bad. I want to go back to this book, Notes from My Biographer. So this is like the rebuttal to Claire Bloom's memoir that only a few people have seen. Blake Bailey saw it, read it. I assume his agent read it and his publisher, because he did actually sell the book. Like, it was ready to go to press. And finally he was like, okay, you know what? I need to hold off on this because people are telling me it's a bad idea. So I was really curious when I learned that this existed, to hear like, what is the other side of the Claire Bloom story. I read Leaving a Doll's House. I thought it was a pretty coherent and credible description of a marriage. Certainly not an excoriation of any kind. Like, it's clear from her book that she really loved Philip Roth, very hurt by it, but also like celebrates him in many ways and has a huge respect for him.
This is the second wife, just to clarify for people who are still following along without knowing the details of Roth biography. His second wife, Claire Bloom, she's still alive, right? She is a renowned stage and film actress. She's British. And they were together for like 17 years, and then they got married at like year 14 or something, and then it became this.
And soon after that, it kind of starts falling
so that
apart.
is, I mean, like, just the bare facts of this case are like strange, and you would want to know, why, once they were married, did the relationship become so horrible? And and then she wrote this memoir that was a bestseller, painting him, poorly, but maybe accurately.
She just describes what he did, or what she says he did. And that looks bad. So I think, and she got a lot of blowback for the book, and was always, it's always referred to sneeringly in literary circles, because of this sort of like allegiance that people have to Philip Roth. So I had read that book. It's actually really hard to get a hold of it. I think it's out of print. The copy that I had bought on Amazon was like covered in black mold, and I had to cut like parts of it off. Like, wow. And then that's like the only copy I could get. It's like pretty expensive. So
probably people are, I'm surprised that whoever owns the copyright of that book did not rush it back into print, knowing that this Bailey biography was coming out. That'd be like the money-making way to do things. But I've not read that book.
It would definitely be worth at least making it available as an ebook, because it's a really interesting autobiography, and also contains a lot of details of her relationships with people like, famous actors that she had worked with and had relationships with. But anyway, so when I'd read that book and I heard that Philip Roth had written a line-by-line rebuttal to it, I was like, I'm really curious, because maybe that, there are two sides to every story. What is it that he can say about her that's going to make me change my mind about what happened here? And really, like, in the Blake Bailey biography, there's nothing that he quotes from that book that changes your mind at all. It doesn't really introduce any new facts. It doesn't prove that she was lying about anything. So I was really mystified by what this rebuttal could have been, because the parts that are quoted, for instance, just sort of make light of her feelings about things. So there's this part where he has insisted that her daughter, Anna Steiger, move out of the family home. And Claire Bloom, in her book, looks back on this very regretfully and says, Anna was asked to move out. She was 18. And I thought that line lands really powerfully in her book, because this is a mother saying, oh my God, I can't believe I agreed to do that to my daughter, and she was so young. And Philip Roth's response is that this is like absurd, because it would only be really sad if Anna had been 2. Mm-hmm. And like, these are not things that really hold water as a rebuttal. That's just him saying, like, I don't care how you feel. It's not like he's introducing new facts about anything she's done that is making her sound bad. So I think that there is a kind of disappointment there in, like, what was this book? What did he think he was doing? I know that that's one of the books that in the Mark Oppenheimer piece, it says may not be preserved or ever made available to the public. So I'm not sure we'll ever know. But certainly it's of note that Philip Roth wrote it and was actually planning to publish it.
That seems a crazy dereliction of duty of the estate, or whatever library is like managing these like pieces of paper or files, like to say like we might never release this or destroy it. Like, at some point, like the weight of history or the future generations deserve. He's a public figure, and maybe wait another 20 or so years.
Yeah, maybe seal them for a certain
again,
period. But like, you have to reckon with the fact this was someone who was preparing all of his stuff for a long time before he died. And he didn't destroy this. He made it available to his biographer, didn't destroy it. I think you have to assume that anything he didn't destroy, he was happy for people to read.
Yeah.
And so I think for the estate to say we might just like pulp this one,
that's crazy.
I think that's really questionable.
The fact that Bailey, one of the 5 people who has read this is now charged with, being a rapist will maybe convince them, like, let's not shred this, let's not throw it into the fire, hold it for future biographers. Okay, so so what did you think when these stories came out a week or so ago about Bailey being accused of sexual assault and like sexual grooming of students?
I think it's actually really hard to state like how shocking the stories that came out were, and incredibly unexpected, because it's one thing to write a book that I found very sexist and offensive, but it's another to be accused of the kinds of behavior that we're talking about here. So though, yeah, I think incredibly shocking, right? I think no one would have no one would be blasé about those stories. Does it change how we read the book? I would say no, because I thought it was a really bad book already. I think that's the place where like the literary world has got itself caught up in knots, because people who praise the book seem to want to make the argument that this changes everything. And like the quotes that I quote were in the first printing of the book. There are many more quotes that subsequent writers have pulled out in their own pieces that I think speak for themselves.
Yeah. So it's a huge mess, as we said earlier. And there's, okay, so the question that occurred to me is, Roth gave Bailey like carte blanche to interview everyone, read through all of his papers. One can't help but, or at least I can't help but wonder, like, if as alleged, Bailey is this like sociopath who raped a woman in Dwight Garner's house while he was like a one-time overnight guest at Dwight Garner being the New York Times book review, one of the New York Times art section's book critics. That is like that. I mean, that's like a Weinstein level sociopathic kind of thing to do. I mean, just like, obviously being a rapist is horrible, but thinking like, I'm going to do this in like someone who works in the New York Times house, and then like participate in all sorts of like New York Times interviews and profiles and activities like that. That is, crazy, like extra levels of crazy beyond the normal criminal levels of crazy. And he had to know this was a big deal. And so he must have, this is pure speculation, of course, but like he basically thought like, oh, what I did wasn't really bad. And so you can't help but think if he uncovered other things that Roth may have done in his past, he may have thought, well, this wasn't really so bad. I'll just, I'm not going to say anything about this, and this will stay in the archives for another 50 years. Like if someone who is an accused sociopathic rapist writes a biography of someone who has a very complicated, controversial, vexed relationship to sex and the relationships between men and women, like what, this is just, I don't know, I'm throwing up my hands once again. So there's that, like, beyond just like, does it matter whether or not someone is like a good person or a bad person, and we have the book they wrote, and should we like buy it or say it's the best one of the year or whatever, like those sort of, is it okay to like enjoy old Louis C.K. stand-up routines because now we know about the various ways he treated women very badly. Like, Bailey was in the position of sorting what goes into the historical record and maybe what is concealed for a long time or forever. And if he is the type of person who did the things he's accused of, then, the historical record has been distorted irreparably. So that's part of it. So yeah, I'm just like very confused about this whole situation, and don't know what to think. That's the part why I wanted to talk to you about it, because you had a prescient view of the book that maybe other people did not. So yeah, did you have any thoughts on that aspect of it?
I think what I find dismaying about the reviews of the book that just didn't mention the sexism at all, or in fact even tried to sort of defend it, is like a kind of refusal to read. Like you don't need to know about these allegations actually to read the book. And I think it worries me that people think that only once they've heard about allegations like this, is it not okay for someone to tell a story in such a sexist way? Because look, this may well not have come out, right? Like we may well not have heard from these women. It takes an incredible amount of courage to come forward and talk to a reporter and like follow through on accusations like this, because let's face it, that isn't the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is that this was a masterwork, as Cynthia Ozick wrote, and that women in the book that Roth didn't like were, quote, harpies. Like that was a word that was being used in earnest about these women. So I think it's about women in the Roth book. And so I think for the women who have come forward to make accusations against Blake Bailey, like that is an incredibly difficult thing to do and very well might not have happened.
Right.
I don't know the story of like how they decided to come together to do that. Like I'm sure it's very complicated.
Yeah. And so part of this is that the woman who was accused Bailey of raping her at Dwight Garner's house wrote a letter to the editor-in-chief or publisher of Norton at some point, like saying this is what happened, you know, and that person forwarded the letter to Bailey himself, and then Bailey wrote a letter to the accuser saying like, please don't ruin my life. I have a wife and daughter who adore me. Like, so that maybe happened in 2018. Is that right? Like, so this is after the Weinstein allegations, and presumably everyone's eyes are open to, you know, the world that was hidden before from many men, although the publisher editor-in-chief, this person is a woman. So it's just like, and so that's insane that happened, and maybe it's something that someone should resign over. And yeah, I don't.
I think that leaves a lot of questions, right? This happened like during, or in fact after the Me Too movement had peaked. So the idea that this was something that could just be ignored even at that moment is shocking. Actually really reminded me of some of the allegations against Andrew Cuomo. Like Lindsay Boylan describes experiences she had literally the month that the Weinstein story is breaking in Andrew Cuomo's office. Like it does seem that even though we thought there was a reckoning happening, in the offices of many men who had a lot of power and prestige, nothing changed. And so I think that's one thing to note, like, not as much has changed as a result of 2017, 2018 as we might think. The idea that this could be just passed along to the accused and ignored to all other intents and purposes is really shocking. And I think, there was a statement from Norton recently saying that they decided to retract the book and they're going to make this donation, but no apology to Valentina Rice. That seems so glaring to me, and no assurances of like what they would do in future. Like what happens if an editorial assistant is harassed during the publication of a book, or sources assaulted? You know, like these are really serious questions that the publishing industry needs to grapple with and have a plan in place for, rather than just saying we didn't know what to do, therefore we didn't do anything.
Right. And I mean, putting myself in the shoes of the Norton editor-in-chief, it is somewhat, it's not obvious what the right thing to do at that point would have been. It seems obviously wrong to send the letter to the person being accused of rape. But like, the Norton just is not like the New York Times. They don't have a like investigations unit to dig into this stuff, and so they could have like hired like outside counsel or something to look into it. I guess maybe that would have been appropriate, but so maybe I feel like 3% sympathy for them of like, oh shit, we've paid this guy $500,000 or whatever, and we have this huge book that we know is everyone's gonna love, and like, oh, suddenly we got this letter from this woman. Who is this woman? What is she actually saying? You can imagine all those things going through their minds, but they stepped in it for sure, and so they have now like retracted, pulled. It's no longer going to be published. This book, although I guess it will pass hand to hand, like Samizdat or something, until the end of time, and so then this is like. Since this is the authorized biography and he did access all this stuff, I mean, electronic files will continue to exist of it and people can get access to it. But so there was a piece that Eric Alterman wrote, kind of a blog post objecting to this and saying like, whether or not Blake Bailey is a sociopath, like you can't just leave it up to the publisher to pull the book when, an author is accused of something, even a horrendous crime. But of course, these are just allegations, unless, it seems extremely unlikely that there would be like this would enter like a criminal investigation at this point. So what is the publisher's responsibility to, the greater project of truth and literature and so forth? What do you think about that?
I think it's a huge mess, right? Because one of the questions here is like, should the book be published anymore? It's sort of the wrong question because it's not like this just came to light. The publisher received information 3 years ago. So the question really was 3 years ago, should we proceed? How should we proceed? How should we react? What should we do? And should we go ahead? Those questions were not pursued. And they went ahead with the book. So in a way, like the opportunity to confront this in the most reasonable way was missed. And you can't really turn the clock back on that. This was a company that has a track record of making bad decisions where this book was concerned, where these complaints were concerned, right? So to then expect them to make a good decision now that it's all public seems quite counterintuitive because, how much time did they spend thinking about whether to keep the book in print or not and whether to publish copies? We don't know anything about their thinking, about the arguments they went through. There's nothing really in their statement about the issues that this raises. It's a pretty unprecedented move to retract a book. On top of that, you could also argue about what that really means. Is it, in fact, possible to retract the publication of a book that, I have a copy of in my house? Lots of people own copies of. I have PDFs of it. Like the audiobook is available. You actually can't retract a book. It's out there. They made the decision to publish it.
In the internet age, you can't retract everything, anything that exists. For a split second can be copied and exists forever in the cloud or whatever.
Like my concern about what they've done is that it's sort of an attempt to. It could be read as an attempt to whitewash their own role in this. The publisher isn't simply someone who is distributing a book. They are actively involved in the creation of the book. Editing it, assigning it, guiding the project through. All of that was done over many years, including in the last 3 years when they were aware of a complaint from Valentina Rice. So it's not as simple as just saying, oh, we're not publishing it anymore. We're good now. I see that as an attempt to rewrite history, and the fact that this book was pursued as part of, for better or worse, the critical history of Philip Roth. It's the book he wanted. I don't have developed thoughts on whether people should read it or whether it should stay in print. But what I do know is that any attempt to sort of erase this incident is pretty dishonest. And so I disagree with that. And I think it's in the same way that you see people who hosted events, like author events, have now deleted a lot of the video of those events. Again, like I understand on one hand, there's an impulse to say we don't want to promote this because we condemn the behavior that's alleged here. And I think that's, for the most part, quite an honorable impulse. On the other hand, I think, where does that get into rewriting history? Is the New York Times going to like remove its reviews of the book? No, they've been published. That is part of the way this book was received. So I think there are issues here where it's like, is there going to be an honest accounting of what happened? And how much do these moves by what is basically a corporation, right? An independently owned company, but a large company.
It's definitely a corporation.
Right. To what extent are they actually attempts to obscure what really happened?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would take these like Marxist or pseudo-Marxist view that like the corporation is working in its own interest and not in the interest of sort of any higher goal of truth or whatever. It's gonna like work to protect itself, and maybe that will include like forcing out some people who are trying to cover this up in the past or something. But like, even if Norton is owned by its employees, like they all, the employees have an interest in like continuing to get paychecks and so forth, and so they'll like do what's in their interest as they see it. Yeah, it's such a mess. I mean, so then there's this other aspect of like the relationship between author and text is like one of the core themes in the work of Philip Roth. And so is Philip Roth rolling over in his grave, or is he laughing at this crazy turn of events? Like this, I don't think it's, you can say this is like, who's going to like write up, someone's going to write a long magazine article or a book about this whole disaster. Someone embodying the spirit of Philip Roth would be a good person to think about it, because he was like obsessed with this idea. So like the first book of sort of the second phase of his career was The Ghostwriter, and it begins where the narrator, Nathan Zuckerman, is talking about selling magazines door to door and whether he can like fully commit to that job or whether he should like sort of do it just as a way to make enough money that he can keep on writing his short stories. And so it's this joking take on like the division between the artist and the art. Which one can you like live with purity, and which one not. So he was thinking about this for a very long time. And so we have both Roth, a contested, controversial figure, having the authorized biography by someone accused of being a rapist and grooming middle school students to eventually have sex with them. And it's crazy. Okay. Let me ask you what you mentioned earlier about how you had avoided reading Roth for some time, and then it was not what you expected when you eventually did read some of his work. Can you talk more about that?
So I had always been sort of put off by the kind of high-spirited, jokey, like Portnoy's complaint idea of Philip Roth. And I just didn't feel drawn to him as a writer for a long time. And then I read some of these later books like Counterlife, Operation Shylock, and thought, okay, maybe he's like, I could read him as a political novelist. Someone whose books are like largely centering on debates between the characters. They're novels of ideas in which the characters are going back and forth about these big international political questions, and find themselves sort of like stuck in these predicaments that actually encapsulate some of the contours of those problems. I found that really interesting. There's still sex in those books. I'm not like against sex in books. I just like, I don't really like it in Philip Roth's books because I find it really boring and like transactional. But I felt like, as a political novelist, he's actually kind of more interesting. And I think if I had written a different piece, it would have maybe tried to probe into that side of things more. But the biography is not that interested in politics. So there wasn't a lot to work with there. And then there was so much on the other side that I ended up not doing that piece. I'm doing a different piece. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think that this was such a weird experience because I had gone in being like, oh, I think I'm going to write about this person that I sort of thought I wouldn't like, but ended up being really into. And then reading the biography, it just reversed my opinions because I think the sort of like best way to read some of Roth's books is by insisting on like the separation between the art and the artist, and the idea that the art is more sophisticated in its expression of relationships between men and women and so on than the artist actually is in his own life. It's like a little more nuanced, a little bit more circumspect in its construction of these relationships. And then to read the biography and see it sort of really collapsed, that distinction definitely makes that reading harder. I mean, I still think it's true that his books are much less aggrieved and much more sophisticated than his personal attitudes. But it definitely is off-putting to see him popping up in the book, being interviewed, just literally like trying to settle scores. It definitely makes it harder to read his work.
Mm-hmm.
To read his work pleasurably, because I'm not saying, I would never say people should stop reading Philip Roth. People should enjoy these books to the extent they can. And if you love Philip Roth, good for you. I mean, I like Philip Roth a lot. One of the things that was really weird for me in the wake of publishing this review was people telling me that like, you hate Philip Roth and like you're a feminist who hates men. And I was like, not at all. I like these books a lot. I see problems with them. I like lots of books that have big problems. I mean, if you're a woman and you only want to read stuff that portrays women in like an equitable way, good luck reading anything like written basically before the last 20 years. That's not my standard for appreciating literature at all. So I think that there's such a mess in the discourse around Philip Roth where if you criticize him at all, you're caricatured as someone who is like an ideological enemy of men. And it really shuts down appreciative conversation from people who have critical points to make.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would definitely like to read, maybe it exists somewhere, I'm sure it will at some point, like a long essay or even book-length treatment on like Roth as political writer. The novel he wrote after Portnoy, which was this giant literary success of the likes that, we don't see anymore, was Our Gang, which is this crazy satire of the Nixon administration before Watergate even, happened. And I think it's a very funny book still. And I actually reread it early on in the Trump administration, thinking about sort of the absurd cartoonish characters from the Nixon administration and versus the ones today. And yeah, so you have Counterlife and Operation Shylock deal with Zionism. You have Plot Against America dealing with, the run up to World War II and this counterfactual history. And, the Human Stain was inspired supposedly by the Lewinsky Clinton scandal. And yeah, so just looking at Roth and politics, there's a lot there. I mean, he is a great novelist. Like his books, as with, the work of any great artist, like there's no correct interpretation, I think. And there's no definitive thing you can say about it. It'll be, continue to be contested as long as people keep on reading, which, they probably don't do as much as they did years ago. But yeah, I think it's I don't know. It's both like, just like a total mess and somewhat like absurdly apt that this is happening. Like if this had happened to like the guy who wrote the Saul Bellow biography, what's that guy's name? He's the son of
James Atlas.
Yes. No, I'm thinking of Bellow's son being the publisher of conservative works. But I'm confused there, but
Yeah.
If that had come out, it would have been less of a thing or something. I mean, I guess Roth is more read today than Bellow, but it's somehow like, I don't know, it fits in our like crazy reality that this is happening. And Yeah, I guess like getting back to sort of like does it matter in the end? Like, why do we care about literary biography? Maybe this will be the last question, and it's like impossible to answer. Why do we care about literary biography? Does it matter? Like, Philip Roth asshole, yes or no? Like, does that matter? Like, we all know at this point, or maybe we all don't know, but many people know today that like Charles Dickens was a horrible person who treated his wife much worse than Roth treated any woman. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like he had her like committed to an insane asylum against her will to like so he could like continue an affair. This is like the mother of his 11 children. Maybe I have the details wrong about that, but you know, so we it's good that we know that, but you know, no one is stopping the publication of Bleak House. Like,
right, V.S. Naipaul is a really good example, right? That biography of him that came out several years ago was a warts and all biography showing a very nasty man who basically tortured his wife. But I think the difference is no one ever really felt that invested in pretending that V.S. Naipaul was like their hero. Like, he's a brilliant novelist, but I don't think there are many
probably a couple people out there who are the big Naipaul.
Yeah, no, maybe. I mean, I love what I'm saying is I love V.S. Naipaul, but I don't feel like that in order to love his books that I have to like strongly identify with like that's my guy. Like his life, you know, is the emblem
he never
for my
said
life.
that he was. Naipaul never said he was Mr. Biswas. You know,
that was his father. It was based on his father. But yeah, I think Naipaul himself was not invested in being seen as a good person, allowed his biographer access to all this stuff that like basically documented what a bad person he was. I think it's really valuable to know that kind of thing. It's valuable to know how the artists lived, the experiences they have. Like, I don't think I said this in the review. It's interesting to sort between what they actually experience and how they select from that reality to make a work of art. Like, what do they leave in? What do they leave out? These can lead to some interesting readings of the work and of the larger project. In terms of like, do these biographies allow us to make meaningful moral judgments on the people and on their work? I'm less interested in that because, again, like I don't think that most novelists become famous for being good people. They become famous because people like reading their books. Yeah. So I think that there's value in the Philip Roth biography that can capture what happened, what he thought about it, without needing to condone or to just present one side.
Yeah, and the way the discourse is, in quotes, is moving is like away from that position you just laid out, which is like this person bad, canceled. You know, I'm never reading the Harry Potter superfans are never rereading their beloved book because they disagree with J.K. Rowling about, you know, trans issues. And yeah, it's just everything has gotten stupider because of Twitter and other social media. And so, yeah, it's more like, okay, this person is a jerk. David Foster Wallace is a jerk. You wrote a piece about the way he treated his female partner very badly. And this is puncturing the idea of him as some sort of like secular saint and font of, you know, all wisdom. And then there's like the other side where just people, this joke that's so stale at this point about like seeing infinite jest on someone's bedstand means like you should run away as quickly as possible. So it's all become like, it's all, you know, the lack of V.S. Naipaul's super fans who are like arguing about it on Twitter and everything is like filtered through the lens of like personal tribal identification and who
I mean, maybe the difference is like there's no one who has in their dating profile like favorite book is A House for Mr. Biswas. You know, like people don't use it as a signifier in that way. The minute you start using Philip Roth or David Foster Wallace like ever as a signifier for who you are, these conversations become so unshackled from sensible conversations about what's written in these books, what do they mean, who made them, what was that person like. Like I've seen people say the same thing about, if you see a man with Roth on his nightstand run a mile, well, what if that person is like a really sophisticated, critical reader of Philip Roth who can talk to you for an hour about all their problems with the book. So I think these conversations get sort of flattened, and there's some truth in the meme, right? There's a reason that people pass these things around, because there's kind of like a modicum of truth in the criticism of people who identify so strongly with these guys. But at the same time, there isn't a lot of room for people who are like, oh, I enjoy this book and I have some thoughts about it. Like that's a very hard position to stake out.
Yeah. Someone should run an experiment with dating profiles and saying favorite bookhouse of Mr. Biswas versus other potential Nobel or non-Nobel laureates books, and seeing, who gets the most, traction on there. Because if someone, I don't even know what the performance of self that people do on online dating apps and other such places when you're saying House of Mr. Biswas. I'm not sure what you're trying to indicate about yourself in order to make other people like you.
Yeah, we should find like the one person who has that in their profile and ask them what they're thinking.
Yeah, why did and they were probably like, that person would probably just be like, oh, I just read it and liked it.
It's a good book.
Yeah. Okay, so anything else you want to say about this before we wrap up?
No, I think that we've said a lot. There's probably much more to say, but it was great talking with you about this. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for taking the time and doing it. I think it was a good conversation. It clarified some things in my mind just talking about this with you. I still think it's just a giant mess, and I don't know where to. I mean, things will continue to develop because the story just broke a week or so ago. I should add that I was excited 3 or so months ago when Bailey followed me on Twitter, and I was like, oh, maybe I can get him on the show at some point to interview him about the Roth book, and then I was just like, 900 pages, like I just can't do it.
You didn't want to prep for that.
Yeah, so and I always read the book when I interview an author, so my laziness saved myself of having to do that thing that various cultural organizations are doing, or trying to scrub their passing. He deleted his Twitter, very shortly after this story broke, and we'll probably just be communicating via his lawyers with the public for the foreseeable future. So that's the weird personal footnote on this for me. Not that this is a question we're considering. I think Roth is a great author and should continue to be read, and people will be arguing about the work and the man as long as people keep on reading books, which hopefully they'll keep on doing. Okay, so thank you, Laura, for letting me talk too much about this, and for a great conversation. And thank you to our viewers and listeners. Rate and review us on iTunes, whatever. Okay, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks. Bye.